Well. Hello, besties. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Happy Monday. Happy Transit Chat Monday. I see you were all here on time today. I love to see it. That means we can hop right into the juicy bits. But first, let me say hello and address the chat. If we haven't already met, if you're watching the playback later, if you are new here, hello. My name is Winter, also known as Mixed Mercury, the Astro Himbo, and welcome to Mixed Mercury University. We have lots to get into today, but yeah, let me see who's here. We've got April in the chat. Good morning, good afternoon. Yes, enjoy your nettle tea. What a gem. Happy Moon Day. Hello, Dr. Deb. Good morning to you. Onyezimi, good morning. Yes, thank you for being here, begrudgingly, but still present. It's not going to be scary, you guys. I'm not getting into anything too crazy. I'm actually going to be discussing a lot of discourse today and teaching you a little something about a little something. So it'll be fun. Hi, Desiree. Yes, welcome back. Good to see you again. Good morning to you as well, Heart. And hello, Lo. Oh my gosh. Okay, I thought I froze for a second. Hello, hello. Okay, bet. So, yeah, not too many things going on this week. I think most of the stuff happened last week. Last week was very busy for me. I don't know if it was busy for y'all, but it was busy for me. So I didn't get to do as much research. Oh, hello, Sloan. Sloan, Sloan. Let me know. But yes, hello. Happy to have you here, present for the live as it's living. But yeah, last week was busy. Lots of exciting developments happening in the background as well that I will share about once I have full confirmation about that. But we are definitely in eclipse season, and then we are also in future eclipses season too, which we'll talk about as well. So lots of different things to get into. The main transits for this week that we're like Sloan. Okay, cool. Or Sloan. 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 Okay. Hey Eric. And hello to the 6-month cousin as well. We love the babies. We love the babies. And the dogs and the cats and the pets, if you have those here as well. Yeah, so this week's Astro, we were just looking at 3 transits mostly. Tomorrow, our good friend Mercury moves into moves into Aquarius. It's in Capricorn currently. So yeah, Mercury hops over into Aquarius, which I discussed a couple of lives ago when I was talking about Mars retrograde back into Gemini and how that changes the flavor of all of our Gemini transits, or rather all of our Mercury transits. So that'll be tomorrow, February 11th. And then February 12th is our big day this week. That'll be Wednesday. We have the Cancer full moon. That's going to be at 29 degrees sidereal Cancer. And then the sun will enter Aquarius soon after that, a couple of hours after that. So these Aquarius transits, in addition to our Lord and Savior Saturn, who has been in Aquarius for the last 2.5 years, these Aquarius transits actually usher us into an unofficial start to the Leo and Aquarius eclipses. So, because the actual North and South nodes are still in Virgo and Pisces through the end of March or April, I can't remember, I have a date somewhere. But since the nodes haven't officially switched over to Leo and Aquarius, this is one of those unofficial eclipses. But it's an eclipse by degree in the sign Leo that is coming up on March 14th. So, since there's going to be a Leo eclipse coming up, these Aquarius transits more or less usher us into our new season of eclipses. And this one kind of snuck up on me. We'll mostly be talking about that today. So, taking a slight diversion away from Virgo and Pisces topics, even though that'll always be in the background of the conversation, to speak about Leo and Aquarius, especially today. Other than that, what else do I have written down? That Leo lunar eclipse on March 14th this year, that will be at 29 degrees Leo as well, if you are curious. And Saturn will still be involved in this eclipse because, again, Saturn doesn't move into Pisces until March 29th. So, yeah, just some things to keep in mind. I see some more besties in the chat. Hello to Jim. Good morning. Yes, I did get my hair cut. It's already grown in a little bit, but just a little bit of a low fade. I had an interview last Thursday, and I have another one this coming Wednesday. So, yeah, had to look decent. So yeah, and then let's see. Samaje's here. Hey, bestie. Yes, hallelujah to the nodes shifting. Leo Aquarius self is shaking in my boots. Yep. Yes, it is a total lunar eclipse as well. So the moon should be changing colors. Hi, Hillary. Oh, so good to see you here, friend. Welcome, welcome. All right. Yes, thank you for the good luck. The first one went well, so I'm hoping the second one goes well also. Both jobs are honestly probably good fits for me. They have their pros and cons, so we'll see what we're working with. Okay, so to start off and to kind of contextualize today's conversation, the thing I would like to teach you about, or rather what I would like to kind of teach about over the next couple of weeks, like I said on my last live, is a little bit more like political history and terminology stuff. So, in the spirit of our air signs, Gemini, where Mars is, and then Aquarius, where Saturn, and then soon Mercury and the Sun will be this week. I want to discuss political identities. Last week, we did a deep dive on fascism and the history of fascism. So if you didn't watch that, you should watch that in my Jupiter Direct video from last week. Today, we will be discussing American liberalism, which very exciting. This is a term that has been thrown around a lot, especially in the last year because it was an election year. And one of the things, this is kind of going back into mutable stuff, of course, but one of the things about language is that the meaning really depends on the person that you're speaking to. And so when it comes to liberalism, I think this is one of those words that, after everything that I've learned about it, has kind of been muddied a little bit. It's a very nuanced word, I think, today, but its history is pretty clear for the most part. So to kind of frame this conversation, one, the video that I'm referencing where I took all these notes was again from Ryan Chapman on YouTube. And this is his video, A Guide to American Liberalism. So if you want to go back and watch that yourself, take your own notes, draw your own conclusions, you're more than welcome to do that. So I am referencing this not from the perspective of a Black American. We will talk about that after I discuss kind of the ways that it seems white people interpreted it back in the 1800s. So just keep this in mind. These are not my views specifically. These are just kind of a more or less objective way to kind of talk about liberalism just as a political identity, as a political term. And then later we'll add more context and talk about why this is relevant today. So hopefully this all comes through together and we can wrap it up in a nice bow over the next 50 minutes. So to start, what is a liberal? Well, today, like I said, it's used as a synonym mostly for Democrat, which is not entirely what liberalism means on its face, but usually people who vote Democrat today have been termed as liberals, but that's not exactly what liberalism is all about. It's a very much more broader term than that. So to kind of understand how we got here in the context of this term liberalism, let's start all the way back in the 1800s with the quote original liberals, which we would call classical liberals. Okay, so these are somewhat the OGs. I don't know the full history of it. So again, this is mostly just the history from this video that I watched. So the most important value for liberalism is in the name. Liber, I believe, is the word, and that's about freedom. So freedom I have in quotes but the most important value for classical liberals and liberalism in general is this idea of freedom. And so that's as much freedom that's possible for the individual specifically. So this is not speaking about liberation of any particular group or anything like that. It's just as much freedom as possible for the individual, right? So this is from an individualistic perspective. There are some restraints that are mostly around violence and like theft. So obviously you can't beat other people to death. It's not like you're not free to just fight people, but you're not free to just fight people, destroy other people's lives. You're also not free to steal other people's freedom under this specific definition of liberalism. But specifically when it comes to thinking and speaking for yourself in the pursuit of happiness or the pursuit of your goals or whatever it is, liberalism is trying to say that it wants you to be free to do all of those things. So under the frame of liberalism, an ideal society is kind of like a sandbox that has basic rules and regulations that everyone needs to follow in order to maintain freedom. So yes, there are some limits. Like I said, if you're going to participate in a system with other people, obviously you can't do everything that you want to do. But in this case, they're trying to maximize how much freedom you have as an individual to mostly be yourself and do the things that you want to do. To mostly be yourself and do the things that you want to do in order to progress as an individual and thus allow society to progress in a particular way. Liberalism is in favor of capitalism, and this is an important distinction to make because they see capitalism as a humane, big air quotes here, humane way for people to provide for themselves and to pursue goals while maintaining a healthy, big quotes again, sense of competition and a nonviolent outlet for conflict. So they're assuming that competition and conflict are, inevitable. and that capitalism provides a safer container, again, all in quotes, a safer container to explore those things without, again, people just going into full purge, fighting, stealing, hurting each other type vibes. Um, Liberals during the 1800s, during this time, didn't want the state to intervene in the economy or in the individual's capitalistic pursuits, because the more that the state is involved, the more the state would grow in power and then become tyrannical and coercive in the affairs of individuals. So liberals, classical liberals, don't really want like government intervention. They want more of this kind of hands-off, laissez-faire approach, which many liberals advocated for, even though they didn't practice it very well, because we know the history of enslavement, and the history of oppression in general, especially towards marginalized groups, but towards all people, basically. Yeah, competition among the slave owners, exactly, to kind of contextualize this. But as far as cishet white men with slaves and with property are concerned, they wanted those people to basically be able to do whatever they wanted to do in the competitive sense without um, interference from the government. And this is one of the things that really distinguishes classical liberals from some of the more modern versions of liberalism. So there's that. Another big value of liberals in this context is equality, which, haha, um, which is obviously inconsistent in its praxis. But in theory, they wanted all people to have equal freedoms and outcomes. So again, what is considered a person at this time, slaveholders, white men, wanted all of them to be able to have equal freedoms and outcomes to participate in capitalism and to pursue their own personal individualistic goals, right? So obviously, this comes into direct conflict with this idea of freedom because everyone is starting from different access points. And so the amount of state interference to make equality actually happen would be considered tyrannical to liberals, because it costs too much freedom. The example that he used in this video was to say that, like, if equality means equal opportunity, then liberals are for equal opportunity. However, any other kind of equality that requires the government to intervene was seen as kind of not liberal, right? Or it drifts away from this idea of liberalism. So, um, the example that he used was like if parents are providing for their kids, right? If this is the theme in question, then in a perfectly free society, parents would be able to do that to whatever extent that they want because it's their freedom to provide for their kids. However, whenever it comes to power and wealth and so on, whenever other kids don't have that same kind of access, then it becomes compromising to this theme of equality as a whole. So liberals would then create policy that liberals would ideally want to create policy that would tax like a rich kid's inheritance and use that same money for education. If the example is like trying to give, if the example is like rich parents trying to give their kids the best of everything, they would still need to contribute to equality in some kind of a way, in order to also have the freedom to give their kids whatever they want. So this idea of taxation kind of slips in as well. But overall, classical liberals are elitist and they wanted voting to be a privilege so that people who weren't educated and that people who didn't own property couldn't have much influence in elections. So this is another thing that kind of separates classical liberals from modern liberals, which we'll talk about next. Um, in order to vote back then, you needed to get an education and you also needed to own property. And so while they did do things like advocate for expanding education, they ultimately didn't, like, they were open to expanding. So this goes back to the whole freedom and equality thing, right? They were open to expanding education, but you still had to get an education in order to vote. They were open to, allowing everyone to own property, but you had to own property in order to vote. So there are still stipulations in mind. And then whenever you think deeper about it, of course, it's like, okay, well, who's allowed to get educated? Who's allowed to own property, right? So it's this kind of fake version of equality that the rest of the world was like, you guys are kind of hypocrites, but whatever. You're liberals. Go for it. Another piece of this kind of elitism is that it was almost like compulsory. I don't know if compulsory is the word, but it was almost like understood that if you believed in liberalism, if you were a liberal in the classical sense, you believed that liberalism was a civilized way to run a society, and that anything that wasn't liberalism was considered barbarism, which is extreme and very arrogant, right? Hubristic. So they felt that they had an obligation to spread liberalism to other societies by taking over the whole entire place and then educating everyone, at least to the point that they could maintain liberalism or liberal democracy or whatever it is in their country on their own without, in this case, US interference. So you also see a touch of colonialism involved in this original description of liberalism. And then as far as major thinkers who you could say really encapsulated the idea of liberalism the best, a big one is John Stuart Mill. I know some people say John Locke, not so much. John Stuart Mill, specifically in his book on liberty, he made a point to take all of these different perspectives of liberalism and put them all together, because liberalism, it's such a broad term, especially at the time, broad and somewhat undefined term, that everyone kind of had their own version of it. So he tried to bring together as many perspectives as possible in his book on liberty. And then out of it comes this one direct quote from, it may be from On Liberty, it may be from a different book. I kind of missed that part, but it says, "The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it. Each is the proper guardian of his own health, whether bodily or mental and spiritual." And he's somewhat paraphrasing another guy named Adam Smith. So by the late 1800s, liberals loosened up their voting perspectives to be more like a classless voting structure, which led to liberal democracy. And then liberal democracy then is defined as a society that's both liberal and democratic, which is in the name. It's capitalistic, and it has civil rights that are backed by law. So it's controversial about like the timing that this started. It could be end of the 19th century, early 20th century, somewhere between there. So I would imagine this is like post Emancipation Proclamation type stuff where this type of thinking comes in. But it basically depends on which civil rights bill that you're referencing. So a lot of people today, if you're woke in the actual sense of woke, you would kind of recognize that we're not as free as many would like us to believe. But in general, a loose understanding of liberal values, which is a little bit closer to a loose understanding of liberal values by this time is basically the default value system of America in the early 20th century. So some of these values, again, are individualism is a big one. And this is individualism as in we should look around and see the country as made up of atomized individuals and not in terms of collectives and competing collective interests. So very much not communist, very much not socialist, very much not, probably not even fascist even just yet, although, potato, potato. But in general, we're looking around, we're saying, we're in some ways a big family made up of individuals who are allowed to pursue whatever they want that suits their individual interests. So bunch of individuals in a group, and it aspires to be tolerant and mutually respectful, again with an asterisk. And so this kind of evolves the term liberal by the 20th century in this context as someone who supports liberal democracy, is for capitalism, for a multi-party democracy, and is for state-backed rights for all citizens, which is a lot of people today, actually, that kind of fall into this category. People who identify with liberalism and capitalism and all of these things probably fit into this newest meaning. Feels very libertarian. You are onto something. I will get to that next. Good morning, Nicolita. Good to see you here. So yeah, so it's like, whenever I heard this the first time before I took notes on it, I was like, oh, so it really kind of validated for me this idea that like, yeah, Republicans and Democrats are actually the same. They're just two sides of the same coin, which I'll discuss a little bit later. But it makes sense because you hear some of these things parroted on both sides of the aisle as far as like this freedom to pursue and do whatever you want to do. I respect you, you respect me, but like we both want to participate in capitalism, so let's do that. They just have different ways of doing so, which we'll discuss soon. So, moving on to more modern liberalism, this is like in the 1900s. So, this is basically trying to make liberalism work during the Industrial Revolution. So, people are starting to get into the workforce in mass. And they noticed the problem of saying America was free and equal whenever it clearly wasn't, especially during this time. So the rights-based, or sorry, right, the rights-based liberals tried to extend equal rights to all people, including civil rights to minorities. So this is including people who were recently emancipated, right? Or including people who didn't want to work in the fields but now wanted to go into the workforce. There were liberals that were advocating for those people. And then there were economy focused liberals who focused on unemployment and equality of opportunity. And they saw the government then as a solution to intersectional class and identity issues that people faced. So this is where we start to see liberals' relationship with the government start to shift and start to be a little bit more pro-government or a little bit more wanting that government intervention that, remember, originally they were like, no, we don't want the government in our business. So another issue was that as America industrialized, corporations become bigger and more powerful. And so for that reason, that's why the relationship towards the government started to shift. Liberals believed that we needed a bigger, more powerful government to balance out the bigger and more powerful corporations. Some liberals believed that big corporations would eventually fall out on their own and be overtaken by smaller businesses, kind of in this way that they would just be too slow to progress and to evolve alongside society because they were too big. So they just kind of had faith that smaller corporations would take out big ones, but this was like a minority belief among liberals. Most liberals didn't feel this way. Most of them really did believe that a bigger government was necessary to navigate the challenges of the modern world. And by this point, with industrialization, most of them weren't really laissez-faire in their attitude anymore. So this kind of is where the split starts to happen between the liberal right and the liberal left. So the liberal left wanted more government interventions in the economy and quality of life improvements, and they took more of a welfare position. So wanting government intervention in this case was saying that the government was going to help individuals achieve their freedom type of thing, or maintain their sense of freedom and position in the economy, whereas the liberal right wanted less government intervention, meaning they wanted more freedom, more economic activity, and that would lead to more prosperity, which would then help everyone in the long run. So they were more particular about which welfare programs that they co-signed with. So that's really where the split begins. They're both still liberal, but there's liberals that wanted government intervention and liberals that wanted more of the laissez-faire attitude. In general, they still wanted to, on the liberal right, they wanted to maintain equality of opportunity that didn't compromise personal liberty. So if helping out somebody else meant it was going to compromise your own individual freedom, then they weren't really into that. And that can be interpreted depending on the person that you ask, right? So then culture is where there's another added layer, and you can think about this as like the 1960s, right? Civil rights era movements. Culture ended up being another point of contention besides just these economic differences between the liberal right and the liberal left. And we start to get a little bit more subsections, if you will. The laissez-faire approach to culture on the right meant to let people think and speak and be themselves without any intervention, without any censorship, without any consideration, probably, for how other people feel. Because intervention would mean some sort of coercion or some sort of coercion from a power with some sort of coercion with a power of a group behind it. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, there was the idea of like, yeah, maybe everybody shouldn't just be able to say slurs. I don't know. So obviously these are still arguments that are happening today, but culture was where people started to diverge from liberalism in the classical sense altogether. And this is where the laissez-faire approach was considered liberalism, but intervention whenever it comes to culture was not considered liberalism still. So there's a little bit of a diverge to where if you wanted to intervene on cultural issues, um, you were probably not liberal. Whereas if you just wanted to kind of leave things as they were, you would still consider liberal. So that part's a little bit hairy to me, but it makes sense today whenever you consider the arguments that we've been having about like free speech and what that actually means depending on who's in power, right? So there's that. So that sets the stage for then today, this 21st century version of liberalism, which is like the 2000s to today, where some people still think that today's version of liberalism is similar to what's been described as like modern liberalism and in some ways even classical liberalism. But others think that liberalism in America today is closer to conservatism. So it really kind of depends on who you ask. But others also think liberalism is just dead totally, or at the very least obscured by bad terminology, which I kind of think is the case because we have a bunch of different terms floating around. Hence today's conversation. So liberalism today really fits into this kind of framework. If you believe in the principles of freedom, individuality, and equality, and you believe in respecting the civil rights of other people, including people that you don't agree with and including their rights to free speech, then you'd be considered a liberal. But if this doesn't describe you, and I would add the caveat personally, if you actually know history and are affected by the history personally as like a marginalized group, then you're probably not a liberal. You're either conservative or progressive or a liberal. And even though conservatism, liberalism, and progressivism are all somewhat different distinctions to say kind of your disposition towards freedom in the context of America, I guess. They're all different philosophies, but you can kind of take from each other. They're not mutually exclusive in certain ways. So this part is also a little bit confusing, so bear with me. But um basically on the liberal right, like the people who are probably the most liberal and right leaning are going to be libertarians, which I think Lo mentioned earlier. Those are people who just straight up believe in laissez-faire, like everybody do whatever they want. Problems will fix themselves based on, I don't know, problems will self-correct. That's kind of like the most libertarian way of thinking. And then the liberal left is going to want the most government intervention while again maintaining these tenets of freedom and equality. So, however much government intervention you need in order to maintain a sense of freedom and equality on the liberal left. Conservatism is about valuing tradition. So, I would say personally, conservatism is wanting to abide by the original constitution written by all of those white men in the 1700s and not wanting to deviate from that at all, including racism and including anything else that was kind of between the lines thinking of the Constitution. And then progressives create value through social reform. So this is constantly changing, constantly reforming, constantly changing and adapting to the times and any ideologies that fit in that, I guess. So in a lot of ways, liberalism can't be divided into a strict left and right, back to this idea that Republicans and Democrats are the same, because all of it's a democratic republic or all of it's liberal democracy, basically. So they can't really be divided into a strict right and left because each group takes from the other to some extent. But like I said, conservatism, liberalism, and progressivism are all different political philosophies that aren't interchangeable. So, you can be conservative and liberal, or you can be progressive. Is that true? You can be conservative and liberal, or you can be progressive and liberal. That might actually be wrong. You can be right leaning. Well, no, I think that is true. I think you can have overlaps, but they're all distinct categories in a way. So I don't know. Again, and that kind of concludes the notes on liberalism. But what I basically got from that was that the main thing about liberalism, that if we're talking about it today, that is consistent to the way that it was described in the classical sense, is that liberals are for capitalism. So if you're an anti-capitalist, you're not a liberal. So whenever everybody's yelling on the internet about liberals, I think this is a good thing to have in mind because Republicans can be liberals, Democrats can be liberals, libertarians can be liberals. And then there are people who don't quite fit in those categories, people who are anarchists, people who are communist, again, people who are socialists, people who are fascist. There are ways that all of these impede on this liberal idea of quote freedom, because again, freedom is about um, the individual's rights to do whatever they want, and that society will basically self correct. That's how I'm understanding it. If you're understanding it differently, then let me know. I'm curious your thoughts. But to me, that kind of cleared up a lot of issues that I think we have whenever we're talking about, let's say, leftists who I think fit more into this kind of progressive, um, more progressive realm. Leftists and liberals always beef because there are some leftists who aren't into capitalism, who don't want capitalism. There are different groups, especially whenever we talk about civil rights, the civil rights era and how that influenced, especially Black people's perception of liberalism in the left, which we'll talk about hopefully next. I'm about halfway through a video discussing that. That also adds in more of the nuances to why you see even divides amongst Black people and other marginalized groups, women, queer people, why there's so much difference between those groups and the way that they perceive um, the right and the left today, and how they engage with the government and the government's role in our freedom and our liberation. So that's your backstory on liberalism. And why I wanted to talk about this as a political identity is because, much of America allegedly, more or less, has been framed as has been framed or has been created through this perspective of liberalism. Um, you might have mentioned it, but I'm curious when the whole leftist versus far right came to be language wise. Um, I don't think I mentioned it, but thinking about the role of government intervention in general, I think is kind of what divides the left and the right. I think leftists tend to be more socialist in general, whether you're communist or not, just socialist in general, as in the needs of the people as a society first versus like the needs of the individual, which seems to be more liberal. So that's my thought. Again, still doing research on that. But all of this to say, as I'm being mindful of time, when we're talking about liberalism, I think a lot of people think that this is like being on the left, in general, that everyone on the left is liberal. And that's not true. Based on everything that we just understood, and whenever you know the nuances of history, whenever it comes to class, when it comes to race, whenever it comes to literal slavery, whenever it comes from, all of these different things. Um, I thought it originally came from the French Revolution. Wait, hold on, let me see what y'all are saying. Liberals are absolutely for capitalism. Freedom feels more like assimilation than self-determination and acceptance regardless of ideology. Yeah, freedom to me is not synonymous. This is really getting into the weeds, but freedom in this conversation in the context of the US exists within a certain context, and that context has a lot to do with capitalism specifically. So that's really the distinction I think that at least I'm trying to make when talking about liberalism for the sake of today's conversation. There's a lot more history and background of America in general and American economy stuff that I'm not getting into today, just specifically talking about um, liberalism and trying to go back to the way it was originally used and termed versus today. So, if it came from the French Revolution, probably. The timeline that I used today was basically like 1800s and up. So, you know, um, I'm sure that's part of it. Liberals are actually absolutely for capitalism. Freedom feels more like assimilation than self-determination and acceptance regardless of ideology. Um, Trying to remember when liberal morphed into neoliberalism. Probably recently. But yeah, maybe around Nixon or Reagan. Okay, setting all that down so I can get to the meat of the conversation. Um, so whenever we're talking about divides between like liberals and leftists, just as an example, because that's like most conscious for a lot of people right now, post election, and why there was so much beef between this idea of like, Kamala representing all of these things that she represented for liberals, but then leftists being like, hey, so not quite enough. for where we're trying to go and people pushing back on that is because there are a lot of people who in fact think capitalism is good and want capitalism to like who if they don't think it's good, they're kind of neutral about it and think that capitalism would be fine under different management, right? Like if the government was involved in certain ways, then capitalism could be fine because there'd be checks and balances, blah, blah, blah. Whereas people even further left, again, wanting more intervention, wanting less competition, wanting less capitalism in general, are like, that's not enough for me because as long as there's capitalism, somebody's going to be oppressed, right? So, with that in mind, I want to kind of shift the conversation back to these Leo and Aquarius eclipses because, yes, please like the video if you haven't already, because we just had the Super Bowl last night. And we also recently had Christmas where Beyonce performed her Cowboy Carter album. We also just had the Grammys where more Black artists, including Kendrick and Beyonce, actually won awards instead of the usual Taylor Swifts and Billie Eilish. No shade to them. Well, shade to Taylor Swift a little bit, but no shade to Billie Eilish. And so kind of having this in mind, and then also having in mind that we're in a time where the government is actually actively trying to get rid of a lot of liberalism. Like they are trying to. There are conservative groups in the background who are trying to get rid of a lot of that shit, who are especially like religiously motivated and stuff like that in order to consolidate power to the executive branch of the president and to kind of get rid of a lot of government support, a lot of government interventions, and really strip away the government to being a lot leaner, a lot smaller acting force, right? So all of that to say, we're in a time right now where obviously is very fascist and accelerating in that direction. But when it comes to Leo and Aquarius specifically, something I'm thinking about with all of this is like, you know, a lot of people maybe do identify as liberals, a lot of people identify as Democrats, Republicans, whatever, but ultimately still want to ultimately don't want things to change in a radical way. A lot of people don't want revolution, or at least they think that they don't want revolution because of the connotations associated with that, especially after years of communist propaganda or propaganda against communism and stuff like that, right? And so whenever we get to things like these celebrity performances that bring up a lot of Americana, like American flag symbolism and a lot of other just kind of notes of American history or anything that just says like proud to be an American, people start to feel like some people are fine with it, but everyone's interpretation of that symbolism in the media kind of goes all over the place. And this, I don't know how I'm going to tie all this together, child, but we're going to try to do it. So it gets tricky, or it gets interesting. So I'll frame it like this first. So when I'm thinking about Leo and Aquarius, kind of shifting gears back into astrology. When I think about Leo and Aquarius, Leo is the I am, and then Aquarius is the I am not. So Leo as in like I am who I am. Now what? Like what you see is what you get. Or just this kind of acknowledgement that someone is perceiving an identity on you, and you are in fact lacing that shoe up and wearing that bitch, right? Leo stuff. Whereas the Aquarius thing is kind of not really seeing yourself as a particular identity, especially not seeing yourself as an identity that is projected onto you. You're kind of like, yeah, I don't like, for example, I don't see myself as an American even though I live here, even though I pay taxes here, even though I'm involved in communities in America, whatever, I don't see myself as an American. There's a dissociation from a particular identity with Aquarius where you're trying to claim something else that actually feels more authentic to you. And at the same time, trying to disidentify with any other reason why a certain identity may be affixed to you. So there's like a resistance to identifying as something. Whereas Leo is a little bit more, I don't know if willing is the word, but for whatever reason, has a little bit more dignity and sense of pride in its identity and sense of self. So, with having just gone through this very long Saturn in Aquarius transit where I think a lot of people are kind of realizing I don't really identify with a lot of the shit going on. I don't really fuck with a lot of this stuff going on. This is not me. That could include your political identity. Maybe what we've seen is a little bit of people disidentifying with liberalism and realizing this doesn't actually fit my politics. This doesn't actually fit my perspective on how we should be organized as a society. So I don't really fuck with that. I mean, and you can make a good case for that considering how many people sat out of the election who just straight up didn't vote. Like couple dozen millions people didn't tens of millions of people didn't vote at all because they didn't see themselves reflected in either party. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who, what I think we're coming into with the nodes shifting into Leo and Aquarius is this question of like, okay, because Saturn, the planet that rules Aquarius, will be in Pisces, people are trying to figure out what these identities actually mean to them and what it means to embody a particular identity and what that looks like in practice. So the Leo side of it, I think I mentioned this a couple lives ago, is also asking, okay, well, I am not is not an identity, as my former teacher once said. So then who are you? You know, if you are a person with American citizenship or a person who even just lives in America, whether you have citizenship and official documentation or not, who are you then? You're on this land, you're in relationship to all of these people. Who are you? Where do you fit? What does all of this mean to you? And so knowing that there's this question, I'm gonna call it for today until I come up with something out. This question until I come up with something else, this question of patriotism. Because like what does it mean to be patriotic in 2025? You know, like on its face, even for me, right? Just the connotation of patriotism because it's been so weaponized by the right, by the far right, as like, you know, American patriots, these people who want to go and fight wars and spread American bullshit around the world or whatever, take over and colonize. Like all of these negative connotations of America are things that I associate with patriotism because they've been used that way by the state. The word patriot by the state has kind of similar to liberalism. It like paints this picture of a person who is in favor of all of these terrible things that America has done to become the United States of America, right? But then there are some people I've noticed kind of woven in between, and this is where Beyonce and Kendrick come in, where I would say a lot of these people are probably liberals, right? Who are trying to reclaim some aspect of this American flag symbolism or just this concept of America as like, you know, for Black people, we built this land, or we didn't build this land, but we built, you know, America. America exists because we slaved off of our backs in order to create it and whatever. Um, that still ignores, you know, like Native American genocides and things like that too. So it gets kind of muddy, but I can see my point in all this is that I can see that maybe what we should be talking about is like when people are trying to reclaim or people are trying to change the meaning of things that have this very specific history behind it, what are they actually trying to achieve? And I think people are trying to work out their identity issues. You know, I think people are trying to figure out how they can in some ways be proud of their ancestry and what their ancestors have done. And this kind of goes for both sides, whether you were enslaved or you were slaving. People are trying to find some sense of pride, you know, on the right. And this is not me excusing it, by the way, in case anybody tries to clip this out of context, but just speaking to the perspective of it, right? There are white people who are very much like trying to have a sense of dignity and self-respect about the fact that their ancestors were violent colonizing slave owners, you know, and stuff like that. Like people, there are people who really go up for that and they're trying to reclaim their American identity and trying to get rid of things like critical race theory and trying to change the way that these things are talked about in schools to make it seem like being white is not a bad thing, right? So they're trying to have a sense of dignity and self-respect about their own whiteness and about whiteness as an ideology. And then Black people in the same vein are trying to find a sense of dignity and self-respect in their history of being enslaved people brought over here against our will and being made to behave in ways that, you know, are not ways that we would normally identify or live in society. Trying to find some sense of dignity and self-respect in that as well, instead of just being incapacitated by the shame of it all. And I think that's, to be fair, I think that's a very complicated thing to do when you are still living on the land that has so much of this sordid history behind it, you know? And so when we get people like Beyonce making Cowboy Carter, which she claims is to talk about like the erasure of black influence in like in country music. I mean, she kind of has a point, right? Like invoking American symbolism in order to do that is tricky because it's bringing all of these things we just described into the picture. It's evoking a lot of different emotions for different people to say like, ew, you really want to like reclaim that? Like, are you sure you don't just want to create something different? Do we really need to wear the blood of our ancestors as a like a reclamation? And then with Kendrick as well, in his performance last night, which to me really could have just been more of a Drake roast and that would have been fine. But he's obviously invoking American symbolism with the Uncle Sam thing and with the colors of the flag, like whatever meaning he was trying to create, which I'm not really here to speculate on, is evoking an emotional experience for people in all kinds of directions. Some people, again, probably really identify with whatever the messaging is that they got from that or that they're projecting onto it. And some people are like, we can do without that. Like, I'm sick of seeing American propaganda everywhere. I'm sick of seeing whatever the use of the symbolism is, just sick of seeing it because of how it makes them feel. Right. So I think, we're really reaching a critical mass of sorts with American as an identity because it means so many different things to so many different people. And I think it's limiting maybe our ability to like actually name and embody who we are because there's no consensus around it. um just like with liberalism, there's no real consensus around what that means today because you can exist on all different ends of the spectrum and still promote it, or you can exist totally outside of it and have a lot of people trying to demonize you for it in the process because people don't want things to change so much. And so the last part that I think is kind of interesting in all of this with this full moon, while the sun is still in Capricorn and the moon is in Cancer, is something my friend Dana White said on Twitter, which was like, I want to say the direct quote because we talked about this a little bit last time when discussing Capricorn transits. He said, folks are looking for the radical and revolutionary in the convenient and the pleasurable. And I thought that was really interesting. Like I do think, I'll say my personal opinion. I think that art in any capacity is subjective. And by subjective, I mean people are going to get something different from the art depending on the person who's looking, right? That whole beauty is in the eye of the observer thing, eye and the beholder thing. I think depending on the person who views and experiences art, they're going to get a different meaning from it. And I don't necessarily think that there's an explicit right or wrong way to interpret art. I think the meaning that you get from it is the meaning that you get from it. And I think it's good during this time to be open to a bunch of different perspectives and interpretations, whether you agree with them or not, to just hear them, to get a sense of where people are at in their interpretation of that art. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of a statement about society as a whole, the way that people are receiving this information, going back into the mutable stuff. And I do think that it's worth talking about our relationship to capitalism and consumption always, because that is what it is to be American, is to consume and to participate in capitalism and oppression of other people as a way to pursue capitalism. That's just part of it. And so what does it mean then for all of our art and celebrity culture and for American symbolism to be used within that context? I think if people, I don't personally think people are looking for, well, this might be naive of me, but I don't know that I believe people are really looking for celebrities to save them. I do think people are looking to celebrity, going back to the Leo and Aquarius thing, as people who have the spotlight, as people who have influence, and as people who can get a message out, political or otherwise, to a lot of people. Similar thing can be said for Lady Gaga, just released Abracadabra. It's a fucking hit, right? But Lady Gaga herself, has been kind of accused to being a Zionist lately, to not supporting Palestine, to just basically being quiet on the issue, but has previously supported Israel in the past. And then also her way of, not protecting her dancers and people from COVID, and having talked about that very publicly as well. Her as an individual is very complicated, but the art itself definitely lifts up, especially with abracadabra, ballroom culture and drag and the LGBTQ community at a time where the LGBTQ community is being attacked, and our lives are being threatened. So I feel like it's important to say your piece always, to point out the things that you're noting and the inconsistencies and to make those known. And I also think the discernment piece of it all is like, okay, what is this? What is the purpose of this art, like, for you, for us? Because we're not looking to these people to save us. They're not going to save us. And I don't know that I necessarily believe that anybody really thinks like Kendrick is going to save them, or that Kendrick is doing anything more revolutionary than just storytelling, which I think a lot of art and music does. Um, Same thing with Beyonce, like the Renaissance album. That was also a controversial moment. Break My Soul was a controversial moment. And at the same time, she really uplifted and made drag and ballroom, Black ballroom specifically, something that the public could be aware of and focus on for a little while and kind of celebrate. There is a place for that, going back to this whole culture thing, to say, like, we will not be erased, we will not hide, we're not going to just shut up and disappear into obscurity the way that a lot of these other strong far right people want us to do. So I do think, same thing with the Grammys, there's a place for that. But if you're expecting it to be anything more than symbolic, really, then you might be drinking the Kool-Aid, right? And I don't know, I think it's good to critique art always. That's the purpose of art, is to critique it. Doesn't mean that you hate it. It doesn't mean that you don't enjoy it and bop to it on your own. It just means you're having a conversation about larger things. And I do think that's the purpose of art, to make people talk, to start conversation. And then anything beyond that, you might be expecting too much from literal millionaires and billionaires who live very different lives than we do, and probably vote in ways that, or participate politically in ways that a lot of us would probably disagree with, So all of this to say, I think a lot of the discourse is coming up as like people trying to sort out what their identity actually is within these systems, outside of these systems, what they want their identities to be outside of these systems in the future, just like kind of what to do with the history that we are actively, that runs in our blood, that also influences and informs how we engage in our day-to-day and how we engage with each other and how we participate today and how we continue to create history. It matters. And I do think some people want consumerism to be their politic, right? Back to the Cancer full moon. A lot of people are just indulging in this art as ways to escape and as ways to give themselves permission to participate and say, like, capitalism's not that bad and whatever, whatever justifications they need to add in order to not compromise their own identity and how they see themselves. But collectively, yeah, like, what is the identity that we are assimilating into? And maybe that's part of the larger question of Jupiter in Taurus also having just gone direct, and this Aquarius stuff being in that square with Aquarius Taurus and Aquarius square, of like assimilating into this versus disidentifying with this and creating an identity to replace it or something like that. So I don't know. Those are my thoughts as we're starting to wind down. Let me see what y'all are saying in the chat. Thank you for listening to me run my mouth. I had to get those ideas off. I love that y'all feel like y'all are in class right now. I never thought I would be teaching in this particular way, but I'm kind of enjoying it. It feels nice. It feels authentic to me. The way nothing has changed, exactly. We will be talking about the Reagan administration at some point. I have a little bit more insight into that now as well. But I was in a daze and I was thinking about it last night and forgot to write it down. So hopefully I can figure it out again. It's horrifically funny how it was taught in schools with how Democrats shifted with Lincoln or whatever. I can't remember, but it always seemed clear it was one and the same. Yes, the whole Democrats and Republicans thing switched or whatever. That's basically what I got from talking about liberalism versus talking about political parties was like, oh, all you bitches are the same, actually. You all want the same thing. Recoils in 2001, right? Um reading you like this because it's you and it's me and all of us Leo Aquarius baddies, okay? Like I'm definitely a person who's always been like, I do not identify with this America shit. But at the same time, I think it's worth questioning because the other part of this I also wanted to say was like, and I've mentioned this before, but I'm going to mention it again because I think it's very uncomfortable to sit with. But what does it look like, again, to have a sense of pride and dignity and self respect in the communities and the nation, more or less, that you live in, and use that as your inspiration to fight with it and to self determine with it? Right? So not to reclaim and not to like take stuff that already exists and make it into something new, but to literally say, okay, like this land is mine. That's a weird thing to say. So I mean this in the decolonial sense, but like I'll phrase it this way. I live here just as much as anybody else does. I pay taxes, and do my civil duties and whatever else, just like everybody else does. I'm entitled to be here, especially as a trans person, like not gonna just let these people run me out of my own home. So what does it look like to have at least enough sense of pride and self-respect in your right to exist to say like I don't fuck with what y'all are doing, and neither do a bunch of these other people. We're all coming together and we're gonna say, hey, cut that shit out, no more. This is what we want. This is how we want to be known. This is how we want to be seen. This is the way that we want to do things, not this imperialist, colonialist, capitalistic bullshit, right? I'm already seeing libs do this, not seeing themselves like that with how Trump is doing all the things that Biden was doing, also times 100. Exactly. Yeah, people trying to differentiate the difference between Trump and Biden as if they both aren't demolishing Gaza. Demolishing, whatever. Doing totally just like, yeah, destroying the area and taking it over. Not like us vibes, exactly. Which is why I think that song is taken off so much because he's really talking about Drake not being like the rest of us. And Drake has Leo rising, by the way. This is not like us is his humiliation anthem. Like that is culturally significant in its own way, which I didn't talk about too much today, but it's also relevant that one of the things Kendrick is doing is calling out pedophiles, even though he himself kind of all the rappers have their own abusive, misogynistic culture stuff going on too. So another thing that's not very black and white, but you know, still culturally relevant. Very much similar to the 2016 election, except he didn't actually win the popular vote. And we did have a big eclipse. That was the last time I believe the nodes were in Leo and Aquarius as well. And also Saturn was in Leo during that time. So still relevant. And arguably he didn't win the popular vote now. He kind of admitted to also stealing this election. And there is some evidence coming out that that might have actually been the case. So, you know. The critical mass T, I feel like the identity point is bursting at the seams with this eclipse energy because the visual representation of the guy holding up the Sudan and Palestine flag really highlights the disconnect. Also that because the one guy who probably did anything, who did the most revolutionary act, or at the very least the biggest protest act, was to hold up that flag at the Super Bowl, which is known to be like military propaganda in and of itself. Literally, football is like symbolic of war, right? So that person holding up that flag in the middle of that performance in a sea of red, white, and blue, and then getting tackled and dragged off the stage, probably arrested, and who knows what else, is a big act of at least resistance, if nothing else, to make a big statement. So totally. Celebrity as a guide or temperature check on what's going on, also permission to do things, yes. Because at the same time, people have also been talking about Sabrina Carpenter. I need to wrap this up. People are also talking about Sabrina Carpenter, as cute as she is, doing her little thing and not trying to appropriate Black culture, is also kind of bringing up like weird 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s aesthetics with it, which we can't just see that as being nothing. It's also relevant, especially during a time where traditional values and conservative values are also kind of coming back into the fold. So It's TV, it's entertainment. What are they actually doing besides the performance aspect? Right. It's meant to be a performance. So I personally just feel like let it be a performance, let it be um symbolic, take whatever meaning you want from it, but it kind of ends there. We still have to do whatever it is that we're going to do in response to it. Expecting Nina Simone's from not Nina Simone's, yes. Da, da, da. The glimmer of reality seeping through the seams of aesthetic, right. Amani Barberin made a great video on propaganda and STEM culture, contributing to it. I have some thoughts regarding consumption, and diluting art to entertainment. We probably have some similar perspectives on that. Because usually, whenever I'm talking on these lives as well, I'm doing the Gemini thing of trying to appeal to as many perspectives as possible to make a point, versus like doing the Sag thing of shoving my own beliefs down you guys' throat, because that's not really what my role is and what my intention is in doing all of this. I'm trying to help you understand maybe why people who don't think like you are thinking and being that way, because don't we all want to know why? Glimmer of reality, indeed. Some of the things that I've been reading, watching, or listening to on Twitter, if I haven't already, yeah. Like I said, some of the things are Ryan Chapman on YouTube. He does a lot of really good, more or less objective breakdowns of complex political histories and ideas that I think have been helpful. He is a white man, so there's that. But I just happened across his page, and so I've been going there. But anything else, I just kind of dabble in so many different things. It would be a lot to consolidate a list. But today's video and the last video have come from his stuff. And then I'm also seeking out more people. Especially whenever I do the civil rights stuff, I will be looking into more Black creators for sure to tell me a little bit more about things like the Black Power movement and Stokely Carmichael, also known as Kwame Ture, and like Malcolm X, and all of the ways that liberalism amongst Black people started to kind of disintegrate, because I think that's very interesting. And even if you don't pay taxes, yes. Surviving in what is versus making something different, yes. Drake gonna be whacked even further with the nodes shifting? Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Wasn't it Malcolm X who clowned the fact that these elections always come down to the thinnest of margins, right? Lots to say about that. I feel like you'd like the soundtrack to a coup d'etat because it really highlights the whole art as entertainment thing, like with jazz and even Nina Simone being headpieces for imperialism. Interesting. He's a Taurus Jupiter case study for sure. Kwame Ture. Oh, interesting. Yeah, very curious about that. Okay. Cool. Yeah, I didn't know that was his Jupiter either. I only have scratched the surface on him, but definitely interesting, him and Martin Luther King Jr.'s relationship and how all of that factored into civil rights protests during the 60s. So, okay. That's all I have time for today. I need to go so I can go to work. I hope that you enjoyed this live. Again, if you haven't already liked it, please like it. I would love for you to leave a comment if you are watching this later. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you got from this. Feel free to add your 2 cents. I will be back next week. Should be back next week. I also have a question. You can respond here. You can respond on Twitter. You can respond anywhere else. But if I moved these to the weekend, would you prefer Saturday morning or Sunday morning or Sunday evening? Just what would you actually show up for if I had to leave Mondays, because I'm probably going to have to leave Mondays, as much as I've been proud of being consistent. So just let me know which days on the weekends would actually work best for you if I need to switch these streams. So leave that in the comments below. You can message me on socials. I see some of the responses coming in on the side as well. But thank you so much for listening. And yeah, there's more info in the description. I've already added it instead of waiting to the last moment. So if you'd like to book a reading, I would recommend doing so sooner than later, because things are changing. So I love y'all so much. Thank you so much for listening and participating in the chat. I love hearing what you guys have to say. Really enjoying doing these lives. So I will see you all next week. Toodaloo.